My name is Don. I'll be working with you over the next few hours as we share our ideas in this interviewing and evaluating skills program. Why interviewing? Is it so important to a company, whether it's small or large? Well, let's discuss this. The productivity formula for a blue-collared worker is your wanted outputs, or the units that were produced, less the rejects, divided by the total cost of your resources, including salaries, energy, electricity, etc., the raw materials, machinery, your equipment costs. And if we employ the wrong person, and I'll discuss what we mean by wrong later on, we achieve less wanted outputs, more rejects, and at a greater cost to the company because of reworks, more energy, raw materials being used. For an example, let's take the best ingredients available in order to make bread. We take all these lovely ingredients and we pop in a bad egg. Now, no matter how much you beat that egg or threaten it, the end result is going to be the same: a poor productivity output. The white-collar productivity formula starts with what we call the aptitude of the person employed. If we employ the wrong person, and when I say wrong, I'm talking about an applicant who has neither the ability, through his lack of experience or education, and or his lack of interest in the job. Why is he doing the job? Why does he want to be employed? And or the lack of the personality required for that particular position. Now, if any one of these criteria is absent, it does not matter how much you train him or her, how much you shout and threaten, the result will be the same: a poor productivity output. Please remember that the skills used in the interviewing program can and should be used in your personal life as well. People need to be heard, to be appreciated, and to have their self-esteem maintained or enhanced at all times. Now, these skills will help you to communicate better with all others. And remember, an important lesson in life: for every action, there will be a reaction. For example, if you walk past a staff member in the morning and fail to greet them, you are going to get an equally negative reaction. However, if your action in communicating is positive, then the other's reaction will also be positive. This is a productivity or a wanted output. Now, I'm confident that this will become clearer as we work our way through the various lessons of the interviewing and the evaluating skills program. I'm confident that you will enjoy it as much as I have in putting it together and in sharing it with you. Right, greetings again. Our next lesson, we're going to focus on the objectives of the interviewing skills program. In summary, the key ones are: we're going to look at the role of the interview itself versus other selection tools such as somebody's CV or any aptitude test that they might have done. We are going to look at how to plan and prepare for the interview itself in a structured method. The questioning techniques. And during this, I will spend a bit of time discussing some of the potential pitfalls that can occur when questioning. Obviously, as you represent the department and you represent your company, your own behavior, we're going to look at that as an objective of this program. And then, very important, how you personally react to certain comments or statements made by the applicant himself or herself. In other words, how do you give feedback correctly during the interview and after the interview? I use the word correctly, and we will define it later in the program. And then finally, how to evaluate the data that we've gathered in the interview and to make that critical employment decision. I'd like you to spend a bit of time now reading through the more detailed objectives on your participant workbook, page 1. Many human practitioners and even line managers have stated to me that interviewing is really a gut feel. It's just plain common sense, they say. Now, would you agree? Would you risk your company's productivity on gut feel? So the answer is no. An interview is objective. It's based on behaviors, things people do or say. It's not a subjective thing, how you feel about something. You are there to evaluate job-relevant experience and behaviors. You are looking at the interests, the abilities, and the personality of the person, as we discussed in the introduction. For example, you ask 2 different people to interview one applicant for a specific job. And at the end of the interview, the first person comes to you and says, boss, that guy came across really well. I have a feeling that he's going to be perfect for the job. I feel there's no problem at all. The second person comes and says, I had my doubts early on. Then he appeared to sound really good in the middle of the interview. But my gut feel tells me something is missing. Something's wrong. Now, how are you going to make a decision to the benefit of your company's bottom line? Remember, and this is critically important, whether an applicant obtains a job with your company will never ever depend on who does the interview. It should be purely a function of the applicant's qualifications for that particular position. The interviewer is a constant. The applicants are the variable, and it's not the other way around. Our next lesson focuses on the tools of personnel selection. First of all, we have the job specification, which we draw up beforehand. And then we have the person specification. Without these 2 tools, it is very difficult, almost impossible, to evaluate a person at the end. What you want to measure at the end is the person's specs at that interview versus the specs required for the job, and see where the match is. Secondly, there is the application form itself, filled in by the applicant. Often this is with the CV, and often with a couple of references. Now, in terms of references, what is the best predictor for future performance? Yes, it is past performance. If a person has behaved in a certain manner in his previous job, they are likely to behave in the same manner in their job that they are applying for. To attach a lot of importance to references, written references which are attached to the application form, is dangerous. Nobody's going to attach a reference if it is a bad reference. And this applies to CVs as well. They contain what the applicant wants you to know. Hence, we have the interview itself. We also have reference checks. At the end of the interview, we check with the previous employer, previous managers, etc. Again, to checking on personality, on interests, and on ability of the individual in that particular job. And finally, there is the summary. The interview itself. Let's repeat that again. Finally, as a tool of selection, there is the interview. And it is the most widely used selection technique available. And we are going to spend most of our time on it. Before we move on, we go back to the application form. Often it gives us the person's name, it gives us their address, their age, etc. And it gives us all the factual details. What we need to do as a tool of personnel, of interviewing, is we need to look at that application form and find other things, objectively looking at, for example, things like how ambitious has this person appeared to be? What is his or her intelligence level? In terms of their job movements, has there been perseverance? The attention to detail can be identified by the manner in which they have completed the document, as can evasiveness. Are there any questions that actually haven't been answered correctly? Also important, of course, are any gaps in dates. How many job changes there have been for apparently no good, cohesive reason. These are all critical in terms of our tools of personnel selection, and these we will discuss in our next lesson. Good day again. In this lesson, we are going to look at the 3 types of interviewing that are available to us. The first one is what we call the unstructured interview. This is a casual, a loosely organized interview. The questions are spur of the moment, and there is no organization at all. The second type is the structured, and as opposed to the unstructured method, the structured is where you have very specific set questions for each applicant. Now, this can achieve little more than simply giving them a pre-printed questionnaire which they can fill it in their own time. The unstructured method, which was that loose, casual one, research has shown that you might as well save yourself time and the applicant time, and you can simply spin a coin as to whether you employ or reject. That's a problem when it comes to the bottom line of your organization. The third method, this is the type of interview we will be working towards, and this is called the systematic method. Greetings again. In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on the systematic interview sequence. If you can go to your participant workbook, page 2, and let's work through it together. The first block on the top, planning. As we can see there, the planning involves making sure you have a complete job and a person specification form. And then to review the application and to prepare yourself for the interview. At the interview itself, moving to the second square, we establish rapport in an interview. This is there to calm the person down, to put them at ease. And remember, we use much the same time, say a minute or 2, on each applicant. We do not show any personal bias towards one or the other. The third square is the gathering of data or information and what we call testing the hypotheses. We mentioned, is the interview merely a gut feel? And we said, no, it's not. When we have a feeling during the interview that something is missing, we then test that hypothesis. We gather more information. It might require us, while we're interviewing in terms of particular likes or dislikes late in the interview, that something comes up where they've contradicted themselves with something they mentioned about a teacher earlier on in the interview. Now, let us test that hypothesis. Let us go back and say, that's interesting. You mentioned now that you don't like people looking over your shoulder all the time as supervisors, but you mentioned earlier on in the interview that the type of teacher you least liked was the one who actually spent no time with you. How do you see the difference here? So we test these hypotheses until the next square. Do you, the interviewer, have enough information to either accept or reject that hypothesis? If you still have a feeling about something and the answer is no, you go back and you gather more information and you retest that hypothesis. You be consistent with each applicant. If, however, you have put that hypothesis to bed, yes, you move on and you close the interview, and then you immediately evaluate using an evaluation form. This area we will discuss in detail later on. Greetings again. This time we're going to focus on the interview itself in the session. During this session, we're going to look at what I would call a roadmap, one way in which we can go through an interview successfully from point A to point B. However, as with any roadmap, it's only as effective as the driver's skills, the driving skills of the driver. And these we call the general principles of interviewing. And as with any roadmap, as with any driving skills, as good as they may be, if you're on the way and you will suddenly come up against something that's gone wrong, unfortunately an accident, or maybe a major diversion, and these in the interviewing process we call pitfalls. Now, I'm sure you're very familiar with many of them, and I have selected a few of the key behaviors which get in the way of a successful or an effective interview. In other words, an interview in which you do not achieve the correct aptitude at the end. In other words, the ability, the personality, and the interest of the applicant. The first one is what I would call being unprepared, starting late. Okay, when you are not ready for the interview and you're not prepared, you're sending out a couple of messages to the applicant. Number one, that the job he's applied for is probably not all that important. But number two, you're saying to the applicant that you are not important. Now, how does he feel about your company, and how does he feel about working for you, a person who is too late to start the interview? Being unprepared, having the person's wrong name, is just unacceptable. Another major problem, of course, which I've encountered is what we would call the leading questions. To say to an individual who's applying for a sales job, you know, what we're looking for is somebody who is able to open cold accounts, do cold calls, and have no inhibitions about it at all. Well, the applicant is going to say, that's strange, because that's my absolute love in life. And you wonder, wow, what a good fit. Until you've made the employment decision and you find that he's never made any cold calls at all. So beware of leading questions. The other one is allowing interruptions. Allowing your secretary to come in to say, please, I have this important document for you to sign. No. Before the interview, you make sure that there are no interruptions. Again, you are saying to the applicant that this document is more important than you are. Another problem is excessive note-taking. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking notes of a couple of key areas as you work through the interview process. I often advise the person that I'm interviewing that during the interview I might take a couple of notes in my executive pads of some of the key areas we cover. However, to have excessive note-taking means that every time the person starts to talk, you drop your head and you start writing and writing. This has a stumbling and a block effect on the communication that is taking place. The applicant thinks, oh, I must be careful of what I'm saying. I'm talking too much. And you are not going to get to the true aptitude of the individual. One that is unnecessary is the equal employment opportunity violations. To ask a married lady how many children she has or what age they are is totally irrelevant when what you are looking for is whether she is able to travel overnight or not. So do not ask the question, how many children do you have? Are you married? Rather, ask the question as you would any applicant. How many days would you feel comfortable travelling per week? By asking the personal question, you are going to annoy her, you're going to make her angry, and she is not going to come forward with the answers and the questions, the answers to the questions you really want. Another pitfall, I've only seen it a couple of times, but it did jar, is the eroding of the self-esteem of the applicant. Obviously, starting late, or having the applicant's wrong name certainly erodes their self-esteem. But in the interview itself, to laugh at the applicant's comments or statements. For an applicant to say, my priority in my previous job was to try and improve the profitability of my sales. And you laugh and say, profitability, yeah, that's a word that we used to use in the past. That's a no-go. The last one that I could mention here is to badmouth your store or your company or your product range. A person tells you that they're having major problems in their company for some reason, and you say, oh, yeah, it's the same here. I don't know what I would do. I'm just snowed under with so much work. There seems to be no coordination, or communication is bad in this company. Oh, look, I'm sorry. Let's just carry on with what we were talking about. So these are some of the key behaviors or pitfalls that can get in the way of an effective interview. And the next session, we will look at the general principles of interviewing. Right, let's introduce the general principles of interviewing now. The general principles of interviewing are basic communication skills. They're used in every type of interview, and these skills will help you to establish an open atmosphere, and it will prevent any form of defensiveness on the part of the applicant where he or she feels they're not being listened to or they are being evaluated. The use of the general principles will encourage the applicant to do most of the talking. We suggest about 85% of the talking, and they will keep the applicant talking about the information and the issues that are relevant to making an employment decision. There are 5 of them. Let's go through them one at a time. First one is to ask open-ended questions. Normally, how? Why have you applied for this job? Describe a particular situation. Tell me about a situation where you felt really good. In what way could you have handled it differently? The second general principle is searching for limitations. Again, using open questions, but here we're looking for disappointments, the liked least in school or part of your previous job, any difficulties that you might have had or you foresee in the job that you're applying for, any shortcomings that you might feel you have. And at times, the third general principle is to press for specifics. Tell me more. Can you be more specific? Give me a specific example. The fourth general principle is to use follow-up techniques to keep the applicant talking. A probe, a non-directive technique. There is the pause. To paraphrase or summarize what the person has said. And if there is emotion in an interview, the person is very excited about something or is feeling very nervous, then a very powerful skill we use is the skill of active listening to diffuse these emotional situations. The fifth general principle is at all times of the interview to avoid evaluative feedback, to be totally non-committal from the time you're establishing a relationship or rapport right through to when you actually say thank you for giving us your time and sharing the information with us. We're going to handle these one at a time, looking at a couple of exercises and concentrating a great deal on the library of questions which are available to us. So in the next session, we will start with our first general principle of interviewing, which is the open-ended questions.